for our speaker to put forth his or her ideas for about 20 minutes or so, and then this will be followed by 2 respondents, each of whom will speak about 5 to 10 minutes. These respondents are, the way that we kind of conceptualize this is that they will be more explorers and questioners rather than actually providing answers to these big questions. Our respondents for this afternoon are Karen Studd and Harold Morowitz. Karen Studd holds a master's degree in dance, is a certified movement analyst, and also a registered somatic movement therapist. Currently a tenured faculty member in George Mason School of Dance, Karen also serves as a program coordinator and teacher for the Laban Institute of Movement Studies in Manhattan. Internationally, she's taught workshops and presented papers in Poland, Canada, Slovakia, and Brazil. Although a dancer, Karen views dance as a highly specialized area of application within the larger body of knowledge that is movement itself. Her interest is in promoting an understanding of the importance of movement across all disciplines. Harold Morowitz is the Robinson Professor of Biology and Natural Philosophy here at George Mason. He came to Mason in 1988 from Yale University, where he was Professor of Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry and Master of Pearson College. At Mason, he was founding director of the Krasnow Institute from 1992 till 1998. His research deals with biogenesis and the emergence of intermediary metabolism. So thank you both for being our respondents today. And as you can see, inter or transdisciplinarity is already kind of manifesting here. Our speaker today, Tomas Arciszewski, is a professor in the Civil, Environmental, and Infrastructure Engineering Department. He's an interdisciplinary scholar interested in inventive engineering, knowledge acquisition, evolutionary designing, and education. In October, his book on successful education, How to Educate Creative Engineers, will be published. Tom has published more than 150 research and technical articles in various journals, books, and conference proceedings. He's also an inventor with patents in the areas of tall buildings and spaces, structures, obtained in 3 countries, Canada, Poland, and the USA. At Mason, Tom teaches courses in the areas of structural engineering and design and inventive engineering. Today, in his presentation, Consciousness 7 Approaches, Tom will present at least 7 approaches to help us to understand and define the concept of consciousness, including approaches with roots in philosophy, mathematics, psychology, metaphysics, and engineering. And this is quoting Tom. The talk is not intended to provide any final answers, but only to initiate a discussion about the meaning of consciousness and to further the discussion about the development of what Tom is referring to as a transdisciplinary understanding of the concept of consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here. Well, I will talk, of course, about these 7 approaches, but I will also very briefly address the issue if consciousness is distributed on central or how it is distributed, because I found interesting pieces of information, knowledge, which might stimulate our good discussion. Well, my presentation has 3 major objectives, which are presented here. I think most important is the 3rd one. In fact, it is my dream that we have here a lively community, we'll have a discussion, we'll have a dialogue, and from our dialogue will gradually emerge our own transdisciplinary, what I call GMU definition, which will help us to establish our own identity and identify our own research niche. So let me introduce myself. I have already been introduced as a structure engineer, and of course this is the reason why I was asked to talk about consciousness, because as you know, structural engineers are great scholars in the area of human consciousness. But of course there is also a danger, because structural engineers deal with structures, with beams, columns, trusses, and frames. So there is a danger that finally, in my final definition, a structure will emerge. We'll see. And I am interested in acquisition of transdisciplinary knowledge, crossing boundaries, and for years and years I've been working with computer scientists, mathematicians, and psychologists. I also invited my wife, Eva, who is here, and who is a chemical engineer, educated as a chemical engineer, but just now she's a Reiki master and practitioner, and she brought to this presentation feelings and natural beauty. So thank you for that contribution, particularly in the part related to metaphysics. I would like to start my presentation with a story, what happened to me several years ago, maybe 7 years ago, when I got invitation to submit a paper to a first international session during a large international conference on sapient agents. As you may guess, 7 years ago I had no clue what are sapient agents. So I asked one of my best PhD students to come to my office. He was raised in Kraków, in southern Poland, in a very traditional family. So I knew his answer when I told him that we are supposed to write a paper on sapient agents. He said, of course, yes, sir, and showed great enthusiasm. So I asked him, do you have an idea what are sapient agents? And as you may guess, the answer was no. So we decided to write our own definition or definitions of sapient agents, and we submitted a paper. I sent him to present this paper during a conference in Boston. To his surprise, he had a room full of people who came to learn what is sapient agents, and it went very well. 2 years later, we were asked to republish this paper in proceedings of a second workshop on session on sapient agents, simply to provide definitions, and it was done. And we are astounded when only 2 or 3 years ago we were asked to provide to give permission to Springer to publish our article on sapient agents in a book toward artificial sapiens, which is a heavy-duty book, mostly written by computer scientists and mathematicians, with our 7 definitions of sapient agents. I'm talking about this publication and this article, but I also hope that my presentation, which was prepared mostly for fun, for enjoyment of working with people like yourself, may lead to something which will be, at least in the view of other people, meaningful and useful. Of course, it is only first step, but I hope that we'll follow this path and something good will happen. So let us start with trivial definitions, which I found in the first 15 seconds of my search. First, what is conscious? It is a combination of 2 Latin words. Basically, it means knowledge, or with knowledge. And for the first time, the word or term or notion, knowledge, emerges. And here, of course, we have 2 interpretations of this word. First is conscious in the context of knowledge, and second, be aware. Be aware of something. Be aware of high authority, or be aware of moral dimension of our life, etc. So I also found other definitions from various periods, basically relating consciousness to knowing, knowledge, understanding, perception, etc. Here, for the first time, we have perception, and I believe in the next slide we have more details about it. And personal identity. But again, personal identity can be easily interpreted in the context of knowledge. This is a moral dimension of knowledge, but again, certain shared body of knowledge by a group of people to which we relate in our activities. Knowledge. Philosophy. In the area of philosophy, I found many definitions and decided to use only 2 definitions or 2 forms or 2 approaches, which I will briefly discuss. First is called so-called phenomenal consciousness, which can be interpreted as acquired experience, multi-sensual experience. acquired knowledge or judgment in certain context. And if we look at these two definitions and try to interpret them, of course, experience can be easily explained as acquired knowledge with all kinds of knowledge components, including emotional knowledge, which I think is also important from our perspective, and judgment is nothing different from at least knowledge-based systems point of view as decision rules which can be used to assess the provided fact or a number of facts. Access consciousness is more related to action, and this is a knowledge which can be used for all kinds of activities, including reasoning and controlling our behavior. Next, I'd like to talk very briefly about classical artificial intelligence understanding of consciousness, and I will present a kind of extreme position in this case to make my presentation more clear, and I will go back to the period which is sometimes called period of wishful thinking, early 90s, to a concept that all systems will be our descendants. And the extreme view is that when we advance artificial intelligence and our studies of consciousness, finally we will have conscious computers, and this will lead to elimination of human species. That a kind of artificial consciousness will emerge, and it will be part of evolution of our planet. Why? Because at this stage, AI people understood universe as a vast information processing system, as a kind of supercomputer. And in this context, of course, everything, including human consciousness, can be understood in terms of information processing. If it is information processing, well, we process information maybe in a more sophisticated way than other living organisms or universe, but the difference is in complexity only. And of course, again, this means that we as human beings are only a certain stage in the evolution of our planet or universe. And obviously other forms, not human forms of consciousness, are perfectly possible. And AI scholars usually use so-called Turing test, which most likely is known to the majority of you, which was proposed in early 40s or late 40s or early 50s by Turing, who was a British mathematician, one of the most talented mathematicians. He's credited with solving Enigma code, although the story is much more complicated. And he also thought about computing devices and formulated the computing theory or conceptual foundation of computing machines or computers. And in this test, we simply have two terminals, and a human uses two terminals trying to identify behind each terminal is a human being, and behind which is a computer, asking all kinds of questions, of course, and trying to guess. And AI people claim that everything is strongly dependent on computing power. Computing power, which is of course growing. And in the 90s, we thought that this computing power would be sufficient to create a kind of artificial consciousness in about 20 to 30 years. Today, again, as you look at this small picture, we know that this period is another 20, 30 years from today. But there's no question that today computing power is comparable with computing power of small fish guppy, which I suppose many of you have in your fish tanks. But we are still far away from human beings. Mathematics. Mathematics brings us back to this book, Toward Artificial Sapiens. And when I browsed this book first to prepare my remarks about our own story, I realized that there's much more behind it than only a nice story to start a presentation. I found a chapter by Leonid Perlowski, who is a philosopher, mathematician, who works at Harvard University, who is a co-editor of this book, who as a matter of fact invited me to submit a paper or chapter to his book. And he wrote a chapter on sapiens, consciousness, and the knowledge instinct. And this is very interesting. Interesting both on, let's say, conceptual side and mathematical side. This mathematical side is extremely complex, and we simply don't have time to talk about it, and I don't fully understand it, but at least I will try to create a big picture. He claims that consciousness and our mind are the same, and his definition of consciousness is as our ability to process or deal with all kinds of non-material aspects of our life, I would say, from concepts, foundation of knowledge, to emotions, instincts, etc., etc. And in this context, he introduces a concept of knowledge instinct, which I found very interesting, which can be considered as a kind of driving force behind our behavior. And this knowledge instinct means that for us to survive, to adapt to ever-changing world, we have to learn. We have to learn constantly. This force pushes us to study new areas and to learn on, of course, all levels of complexity. He proposed what he calls modeling field theory, which describes how consciousness operates. He identified a number of operating mechanisms. So again, we are coming back to this concept that this is information processing system. Okay? Although this is much more sophisticated and under many additional assumptions, and basically claims that consciousness is nothing else but a multi-level hetero-hierarchical system. At first I didn't know what is hetero-hierarchical system, as of course some of you may not know. But it is a hierarchical system, but with such a hierarchy which can change, and in which you don't have one line of action. You have feedbacks instead of flow of information, and these feedbacks or interactions between different levels in hierarchy create a very complex behavior. So he also claims that consciousness is part of human ego, and consciousness basically drives our will to survive, to adapt, etc. And for the first time we introduce here the concept of adaptation, which I understand in very narrow terms as a knowledge acquisition and utilization process which has to be conducted in order to optimize our own activities and in order to maximize our chance to survive, not only in physical terms but also in professional terms, emotional terms, etc. So this is, I think, quite important. And finally we are coming back to a concept of sapiens, which is understood as a kind of generalized wisdom, the highest form of knowledge and understanding of the world. And he claims that consciousness and sapiens are very close, are interrelated concepts, but they are different. Consciousness is focused on action, while sapiens is more focused on knowledge acquisition. But they are interrelated, and of course both are related to knowledge and knowledge acquisition. Let us talk about metaphysics. I think it will be the most beautiful part of my presentation. And in this case, all these definitions are in beautiful, emotionally charged language to fully understand them. So consciousness is foundation of all existence, all is everywhere. Consciousness is simply the universe. And organizing principle, which basically makes us what we are in the context of universe, in the context of our emotions and behavior. And here we have all kinds of related definitions of consciousness. And I think most interesting is the last one, is the energy that is the root of all awareness, energy. As you know, in metaphysics, we understand the universe and us in the context of energy, and energy exchange, energy fields, etc., etc. So consciousness, in this case, is expressed in terms of energy. But it also brings us for the first time to the concept of distributed consciousness, which I found amazing. In the case of metaphysics, we have two forms of consciousness: consciousness of mind and of heart. Each serves a different purpose. First is, I would say, mostly about communication, and communication on both rational and emotional level. And of course, this is a part of our existence. Loving kindness is more on emotional and spiritual level, if I'm correct. And of course, this loving kindness is part of our consciousness from the point of metaphysics. Well, I'm an engineer, so I'd like to talk about engineering. And I have good news that consciousness was discovered in engineering. And not long time ago, only about 10 years ago, when AAC began working on a reform of civil engineering education. I slightly oversimplify, of course. But for the first time, I think, in written documents released by AAC, we talk maybe not so much about consciousness as such, but about awareness. And, of course, consciousness and related awareness should be or are reflected mostly in courses on engineering ethics, but not only. Good professors like Professor Harp, who is here, I'm sure, talks about awareness of various social dimensions, even teaching courses on optimization of water distribution systems. But engineering consciousness is usually understood as awareness, as a specific kind of awareness, awareness of a non-engineering world, translated into engineering terms, and of course awareness of impact of our engineering activities on this outside world. And if we have this understanding, of course we have all kinds of awareness which could be discussed, which could be introduced, and of course developed. I added even tribal consciousness. I spent several years teaching in Africa, and of course this tribal consciousness in Africa is always there. And it is absolutely critical to be aware of this at least. Well, I became interested in cybernetics in early 70s, and I think that cybernetics is extremely important to understand the world, processes, and even people. This is a trivial general definition of what is a system, definition which I believe you all know quite well. I think more interesting from our point of view is the definition of a so-called complex adaptive system. I distinguished here, identified 4 major features. So it means it is a system which has sufficient number of components that it can change its structure, and of course its components can be changed. Behavior of a complex adaptive system cannot be predicted. It is an emerging behavior. We know everything about individual components, but when we put them together, we have no clue what will happen. Oversimplified. This system has also an ability to adapt, that means to change, both on structure level and on the level of individual elements, and this process of adaptation is driven by feedback coming from outside. And finally, I believe it is also important, a complex adaptive system should have or has an ability to learn, to acquire knowledge. And the simplest form of acquiring knowledge is through inductive learning, considering negative and positive examples coming from the environment. So this is complex adaptive system, and in this context I'd like to introduce the concept of human knowledge system, which is presented here in 2 forms, as a system which is composed with, from all kinds of subsystems, dealing with all kinds of knowledge, which can be procedural, methodological, can be emotional, factual, etc., etc., and can be in general understood as a certain body of knowledge which is not only necessary but also sufficient for a human to operate in his or her environment, which seems to be, I think, relatively simple, and it leads us to my maybe naive, maybe too simple definition of consciousness. Consciousness is a complex, adaptive human knowledge system. And I think that this definition covers whatever definitions we introduced earlier. And it's relatively simple. Maybe it is too simple, I don't know. I'm here to learn about it. But in any case, it brings us to the final issue of central or distributed consciousness, which I found interesting. Where is consciousness? Where is it located? I don't know if anybody knows the answer. So there are all kinds of hypotheses we could, of course, investigate. First, that it's located in our brain, and in this case we have at least two cases, that it is a single point in our brain, single system somewhere hidden, or distributed system throughout our brain, or consciousness is distributed throughout our entire body, or maybe through the entire universe. I simply don't know. I hope that you, as experts in this area, will tell me. So if we talk about central brain-located consciousness, it is traditional understanding. It is, of course, a single knowledge system. But distributed brain-located consciousness has different forms, going back to at least to Freud, to 19th century, if I'm correct, who proposed concepts of consciousness and subconsciousness, and who talked about consciousness as a system with these three major components: ego, superego, and I understand ideas, identity. Yeah? And I also found very interesting definition coming from Gilligan, who claims that female consciousness has multiple equally valid voices, so multi-consciousness. I suppose that this also implicitly implies that a man is a much less sophisticated beast with a single voice, that you will tell us. And finally, we might say that in this case, consciousness is a large collection of intelligent agents, or maybe even sapient agents, or maybe so-called cognitive agents. Most likely will be joined in a few minutes by Professor Tekuchi from our School of Information Technology, who is a director of a large center which is called Intelligent Agent Center, and he's working in the area of cognitive and intelligent agents. So maybe this is our conscious. But of course we have also this concept of distributed consciousness, and this is a relatively recent concept, mostly known mostly among holistic scholars and energy healers. And in this case, it is related to so-called distributed brain. It means, of course, consciousness is related to brain, and the distributed brain may be distributed throughout the entire human body, and we can distinguish different levels of distribution. I don't know which one is the right one. It can be only brain and heart, or it can be related to 7 chakras if we use this holistic or energy understanding of human body, or maybe our consciousness is distributed throughout all cells in. I don't know answers. I'm here simply reporting my findings, which made me, I must admit, thinking. So, conclusions. My time is nearly out. I believe that my presentation wasn't supposed to create specific results or conclusions. I was here more to start the process than to close the process. But I see many emerging voices in the context of this feministic understanding of consciousness, which are equally, I think, valid. That consciousness is our sapience, or maybe our mind, maybe it is our learning and adaptation, maybe this combination of these. Many questions, many fascinating questions. I hope that you know answers to all these questions, but I don't. And to close my presentation, I'd like to mention consciousness in action. Vicky mentioned that I will be publishing a book on, Professor Teguchi is here, welcome. We just talked about distributed conscious and intelligent agents and cognitive agents, and I promise that you will tell us if consciousness could be presented or understood as distributed conscious in the form of
maybe
agent.
on another occasion.
But I'm very happy that you came. So I was talking about this book, which will be published very soon. And when I wrote this book, I had no clue that it would be related to consciousness. And of course, in the entire book, which is mostly about how to make students or people in general more creative, I realized that it is, of course, related to consciousness and could be considered as consciousness in action. So this is my contribution to this meeting. And now we have two experts who will provide answers as I formulated only questions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for opening our discussion. Karen, would you start?
I think one of the things that stood out to me as I was listening to you was this idea of knowledge, which then triggered in my own brain ideas of wisdom, and then that idea of what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. And I started thinking about aspects of knowledge being more Western analytical model and wisdom being more an Eastern synthesizing model. And I think eventually you came around to some of this. So the things that were kind of going through my brain were then also being reinforced by what I was hearing, which was interesting. Another thing that was very interesting to me was when you were talking about a little bit about the model where humans will become extinct, that portion, and thinking about, oh, well, that for me reminds me of something that I always find myself in exchanges with people about, how we often switch the core and the periphery when we're talking about anything. And I tend to think of computers being something that have been generated from us, so that there is this idea that, or even going to the metaphor of body of knowledge coming from the human reality, which is inherently physical. And somehow, in that instance, that notion sees the periphery reversal to the core. So I see that the idea of us eventually becoming extinct due to the fact that everything becomes more or less a giant computer, I guess, for simplistic terms. And it's almost like, well, no, it doesn't seem like that would happen at all to me. I don't understand that way of thinking. And even the notion that, again, to go to kind of pop culture ideas, the fact that our technology has so disembodied us in a way, and this is such a common feature of contemporary life. And yet at the same time, we now have the big phenomena of the we, where we're now using technology to bring us back to our bodies. And I find that idea of coming full circle so fascinating. So, again, I don't know that I have any added insights. It was just very intriguing to me that much of what you said triggered lots of these kind of thoughts within me about several areas of application that I'm interested in personally in terms of human movement. And obviously I fall, I think, more into the body distribution area of looking at consciousness from that perspective. So.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Hard act to follow. When I read through this material which had been sent to me, my first
response. Well, this is a thesaurus of consciousness that I was being given. And I had to admit that I'm going to be presenting something much narrower than the thesaurus, and so it's going to give us a kind of two-sided view to look at, which I think is the purpose of being here. My views of consciousness really go back to Immanuel Kant. And for Kant, consciousness is a primitive. And it being a primitive, it would be undefinable in all of the modes that we have been discussed today. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I think Kant meant by it being a primitive. Of course, everybody has a different view of what Kant thought, but that's another. But for Kant, if you think about Kant's epistemology in the Critique, he starts with, in a sense, perception. And perception for consciousness consists of the a priori and the a posteriori. The a priori is what the mind brings to the sensory phenomenon, and the a posteriori is what the external world brings to the mind in the sensory phenomenon. So that leaves you with, as I say, with two undefineds. There's the world out there, which generates one part of the sensory phenomenon, and the world for Kant ends up in the Ding an sich, which is unknowable. And I think in the same sense, the other pole is going to be consciousness or the mind, which is going to be unknowable in that same sense. But I don't mean to be discouraging. I think there are ways in which we can deal with this. But for instance, so if you look at the philosophy of science as it emerges in a philosopher like Henry Margenau in his book Physical Reality, where he takes the Kantian point of view, where you have the phenomenology, the color, the shape, and so forth and so on, and out of that, the mind constructs a table. And then the whole series of philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, a la Margenau, is a descending set of constructs rooted in the phenomenology and heading from the sensory to the Ding an sich in a series of levels, each level subject to experimental verification, etc., etc. Margenau has called these constructs because it's the mind constructing. And this is classical reductionism. But classical reductionism leads its way to what Kant would call the unknowable Ding an sich. Kant believes there's a real world out there, but its explanation is in terms of the Ding an sich, which we'll never get to, although some people would like to think it's at superstrings, but Kant would say, no, you got more to go. And so that's the kind of epistemology. Now, in the last, this is classical reductionism. In the last 20, 30, or 40 years, we've had emergence, which is where you start at these lower levels, and you have to start any place you want to start because you never get to the bottom. So you start wherever you want to start, and you work your way up through atoms, molecules, proteins, cells, etc., etc., and you're working your way back up to the brain, to the body and the brain. And for the neurobiology, then you would look for the mind, for consciousness in the brain, which has emerged from the constructed hierarchies, which gives you all of modern science. But the point is, you're going to come back where you have to come back to the upper primitive, which is consciousness. So you have two unknowables. You have the consciousness and the Ding an sich. And that may sound discouraging to some. It did to me when I first thought about it. But I think because it looks like a curious kind of circular reasoning. And if you call it circular reasoning, you kind of sneer at it. If you call it the great epistemic circle, you'll be enamored of it. And so for me, which is not to say that all the kinds of consciousness we've been instructed in today aren't part of that whole story, but consciousness itself is a curious kind of primitive, just like the Ding an sich is a kind of primitive. And the fact of the matter is we're not going to know everything. We're going to be left with some primitives, and I think at the moment my feeling still is that I haven't come out of the Kantian position that that consciousness is one of the primitives.
Thank you both. Tom, would you like to respond first and then you can open it, or how would you like to?
I would like to listen. I suppose that I shouldn't respond because these were voices which are equally important. It isn't so that one of these voices was wrong, mine was right, or I was wrong. These were different voices related, which somehow reinforced my message that this is an open, very complicated field, and many dimensions could be studied. And I loved all these comments on the philosophical side.
Okay, so why don't we open it up? Someone like to start? Yeah.
Maybe I can start with a question to Carl. Sorry. You say that there are two unknowables, but it seems like consciousness is the part that we are aware of. So how is that unknowable?
Well, it's a primitive. I mean, we're aware of mind and we're aware of matter. And Kant would argue they're both there. He believes in a real world. But to dissect them down to some more fundamental is where he finds the great difficulty. Yeah, I agree. We're aware of consciousness, and it's there. I mean, it's a primitive. It's part of our existence, and it's why we're all here, and so forth and so on. But there may be a certain sense, just like superstrings don't take you to the Ding an sich, the mind that we know doesn't take you to the ultimate consciousness.
Yeah.
So I was kind of struck with the fact that if you look at those definitions in English, I mean, there are probably similar things in other languages, but back to Samuel Johnson from 1650 or something, all of those definitions we kind of recognize today, and they could fit today in how we would write a dictionary, perhaps. But some of these other things, like Kant and his philosophy of how you think of consciousness and the various artificial intelligence ways of thinking about it, all of that is much deeper and is not yet reflected in everybody's common meaning of the word consciousness today. I mean, as a simple sort of thing. And I think we're delving into it in many more ways than people tried before, which mostly was based on philosophy and sitting thinking. And now we actually have many ways that we can tinker with human consciousness and turn it on and off. And so we may, in fact, be learning a lot more in years and decades to come in ways that we never could have imagined learning about it before. But I don't think the common conception of it is catching up or has caught up to where research and thinking is getting.
Yeah.
If I may, there were very broad spectrum of different definitions. When can we be conscious, and what this means is really a broad question as we see it. But how I think that we are all struggling with answering properly to just two questions. Who are we really? And what are we doing here? And people may say, hey, I really know who I am, and I know what I'm doing. We are professionals, we really are engaged in many very important activities, but when you are just sitting by yourself and sometimes overwhelmed with the world, because it imposes on you many things, and what am I doing here? Who am I? What's the reason for this struggle, what is the reason for the glory on two different extremes? And if somebody would just give you like an exercise, okay, just take a piece of paper and write the answer, like, who are you? I am blah, blah, blah. I am a professor. I am a mother. I am a friend. You would make a list, maybe several pages, and then you would feel totally exhausted. Is this who I am? And then the consciousness just triggers so many different levels, because we are not only the bodies, and this is what we are doing here. We are much more than this. And then those answers start getting deeper and deeper, and it's just like opening a new portal, and it just you just fill another several pages, and then you're exhausted. And who am I? And you say, well, I don't know. Am I all this? And then you then even start answering a question: what I am here for? What's my purpose? So this builds a consciousness. And this builds on knowledge, this builds on feelings, this builds on emotions. Maybe answering those questions we will start crying. Maybe answering this question we will start jumping of joy. That's how complex we are. You know, the consciousness is just everything. It's everything. It's who we are internally, is the most important part of who we are. And we put all those sticky notes, just I am a professor, I am a mother, I am a friend, and I think, who am I? And gosh, when you uncover who you are, I wish you achieved that moment.
So I'd like to reinforce what Eva was saying. One of our first courses coming out of our center is the course I teach on Wednesday afternoons I'm about to leave for. And I've got 27, 20, and 21-year-olds, and the course is Consciousness, Meaning, and Life Purpose. And so we're exploring the topic of consciousness through these questions about what gives us meaning and what gives us a sense of intentionality and purpose. And it makes it a very lively subject for these young adults.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Actually, I attended your lecture on meditation.
Right, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
So I think there is a danger in equating consciousness with knowledge, because it seems like knowledge is a broader concept. Like, for example, the whole list of things that you just named, plus many more, are our human knowledge, but I believe that only a small part of them is currently in my consciousness, which is my spotlight of awareness of my knowledge. Also, when the brain is at sleep, the knowledge is still there, is stored in synapses, but there is no consciousness. There is also danger in equating consciousness with mind, because there are many subliminal processes which can be considered mental. And so probably the right word for consciousness would be awareness, or as Chalmers actually says it in his book, it's subjective experience, which is kind of different from knowledge. You might have knowledge stored in a computer, you might have knowledge stored in a book, and no consciousness in a book. So then what makes so special about human beings capable of subjective awareness, and let's say computers do not capable at this moment. Well, in my view, this is probably an attribution of this awareness to a subject, of the self, which we know doesn't exist. It's an illusion, but every instance of consciousness nevertheless is attributed to this imaginary self. And this is probably what makes it different between us and knowledge represented in a computer. Okay, I stop here.
So it sounds like, what you're saying about consciousness is that consciousness is something that lives kind of within the confines of an individual body.
Oh, I did not mention that. That is another interesting question. Where does it live? Because actually, we have no reason to infer that it lives in the brain or in the body or in the whole universe. We just have it, this subjective experience, and we can measure neural correlates of it. We know that such and such experiences correlate with such and such physical processes in the brain. But where is the experience per se located? We do not know. Maybe it's outside of this world. So it's an open question.
Yeah, and besides that, we tend to see the world through our own eyes. Oh, we humans, we are the best, we are on the top. And actually, there is a consciousness in a tree, there is a consciousness in non-animated object. Somehow we can give the sense of understanding that the fork is happy to be a fork and the pen is happy to be a pen too. And when we go deeper, really much deeper to the chemical engineers coming here, how everything is structured. We are the same. They are the same molecules, the same, on nano level. We are the same. Some subsystems for animated, some other for non-animated. So there is a consciousness again of oneness, that actually we are one with all. And here the responsibility that since we understand that, we should really honor everything around us. It's not to trample on this planet. We can do it. This is for us. That's a consciousness. That's a global consciousness. I think about global consciousness and awareness of this what's happening. And it is the last 20 years. It was never like that in the human history before. Like people are, because of communication, because of the computer, because we can really be one with somebody on the other side of the planet. This really brings the consciousness that we are one.